Always wrote her letters with a fountain pen, blue-black ink, on thick, cream-coloured stationery. The ritual was sacred, an act almost meditative, performed in the quiet hours after midnight when the world felt furthest from its noise and closest to the truth. The letter on her desk, however, had sat untouched for nearly 2 weeks, its envelope unsealed. The handwriting paused mid-sentence, as if her thoughts had fled the moment she tried to give them form. She had tried to finish it countless times, sitting in the dim light of her study, fingers curled around the pen, eyes searching the ceiling as if the words she feared to write might appear like stars breaking through clouds. But they never did. The ink remained dry, the letter unfinished. It had been 10 years since Evelyn last saw Michael. 10 years since the accident that rewired the trajectory of her life and left behind a silence too loud to ignore. They had met in college, an inevitable meeting, she liked to believe, like gravity drawing moons to orbit. He was a literature major with a taste for obscure poetry and a laugh that always broke the tension in a room. She was studying psychology, equally fascinated by the human mind and repelled by its inconsistencies. But with Michael, inconsistencies didn't matter. He was reckless in a way that made the world feel less heavy. She was careful, grounded, sometimes too much so. Together they balanced each other out, or so they believed, until that night. Evelyn remembered every detail of that rainy evening. The thunder echoing in the distance, the whiskey breath in Michael's voice, the argument sparked by something trivial, an old text message, a forgotten birthday, maybe just the frustration of two people trying too hard to hold on to something unraveling. She had begged him not to drive, threatened to call the police if he left, but Michael had always hated being told what to do. "I'm not a child," he had said, keys in hand, anger smouldering in his eyes. 15 minutes later, his car had wrapped itself around a tree just outside of campus. He survived, but barely. The months that followed were filled with hospital visits, surgeries, and finally the decision to leave everything behind. They hadn't spoken since. Evelyn carried the guilt like an unhealed wound. She had moved on, or at least that's what she told others. She had finished grad school, started a private practice, even got engaged once, though it ended before the wedding. She lived in a quiet apartment now, filled with books and old records, a cat named Sylvia, and a shelf where she kept every letter she had ever written but never sent. Most were to Michael. Some were angry. Others read like confessions. But the latest one, this one she couldn't finish, was different. It wasn't about blame or apologies. It was about something deeper, something terrifying. Forgiveness. She had seen Michael's name again by accident. A client had mentioned a local rehab centre hiring trauma counsellors. Evelyn had looked it up out of curiosity, and there he was, Dr. Michael Lawn, programme director. Older now, with a beard and greying hair, but unmistakably him. Her heart had clenched in a way it hadn't in years. That night, she started writing the letter, unsure of what she hoped to accomplish. She didn't want to rekindle anything. She didn't even know if she wanted a reply. She just wanted to tell the truth, to say the things that had haunted her all this time. But the more she tried, the more the words slipped away. She feared that finishing it would force her to feel everything she had worked so hard to bury. Yet the letter remained. Evelyn folded the half-written letter for the 6th time and tucked it back into her leather-bound journal, the one she had kept for over a decade and only wrote in when memories clawed too loud inside her. She sat back in the creaky armchair beside her study window, watching dusk settle over the city like a slow exhale. The rain had returned, just a drizzle this time, but enough to make the streets blur and shimmer under the street lamps. Something about rain always made her think of him. Not the night of the accident, but the countless rainy days before it. They used to sit on the windowsill of his apartment, drinking burnt coffee, reading Rilke aloud while the sky wept softly outside. The memories never asked for permission. They slipped in like ghosts, uninvited but familiar. Michael's smile when he was trying not to laugh. The way he tapped his pen against his teeth while thinking. How he once claimed that every important moment in life could be distilled into a sentence, and that letters were just a way to time travel. Write it down, he used to say, even if it's ugly, especially if it's ugly. Evelyn had once admired that honesty. Now it terrified her, because to finish this letter would be to unravel a part of herself she had kept too tightly wound for too long. She opened the journal again, fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes scanned the unfinished lines. Michael, I saw your name today and my hands forgot how to stay steady. That was as far as she had gotten. The rest was a blur of crossed-out sentences, half-formed thoughts, and a smudge of ink where a teardrop had landed. What was she trying to say? That she was sorry? That she hated him for not listening? That she hated herself more for letting him go? Or that after 10 years, she still thought him every time silence stretched too long between heartbeats? The doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected, so sudden, that she flinched. She glanced at the clock. 7:42 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. Probably a delivery at the wrong address, she thought, but still, her heart rate picked up. She padded softly to the door, peeked through the peephole, and froze. It was Leah, her old college roommate and Michael's closest friend after Evelyn. They hadn't spoken in nearly 8 years. Evelyn's hand hovered at the doorknob, uncertain whether to open or retreat, but curiosity won. "Leah?" she said, opening the door slowly. "Hi, Evie," Leah replied with a tired smile. "Can I come in?" Evelyn stepped aside, still processing her presence. Leah looked older, as they all did now, lines around her eyes, a weariness in her step, but her energy was the same. She carried a satchel bag and clutched it like it contained something delicate. They sat down in the living room without speaking much, the silence between them filled with the gravity of things unsaid. "I was in town for a conference," Leah finally said. "I wasn't going to reach out, but I saw your name on a therapy brochure, and I thought maybe it was time." "Time for what?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew. Leah hesitated, then reached into her bag. She pulled out a yellowed envelope, no address, no stamp. Just Evelyn's name, written in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. "He wrote this before he left the hospital," Leah said. "He asked me to give it to you. But I couldn't. I didn't think you'd want it. And honestly, I was angry too. At both of you. But when I saw your name, I knew I had to give it to you. It's not mine to keep anymore." Evelyn stared at the envelope like it might combust in her hands. Her fingers brushed the edges as if it were fragile. She didn't open it. Not yet. Her mind was reeling. Michael had written her a letter, and Leah had kept it all these years. The weight of 1,000 words suddenly pressed down on her chest. "I should go," Leah said, rising. "You don't have to read it tonight, or ever, but it's yours." Evelyn didn't stop her from leaving. She stood at the door long after Leah disappeared into the night, the letter clutched tightly in her hand, heart pounding against her ribs like a warning. Back inside, she placed Michael's letter next to her own unfinished one. 2 stories waiting to collide. 2 ghosts aching for a voice. The envelope sat on Evelyn's desk for 2 more days, untouched and unopened. She would walk past it on her way to the kitchen, glance at it during therapy sessions while her clients talked about abandonment, grief and healing. It haunted her presence like a whisper in a chapel, quiet but impossible to ignore. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but in truth, she was afraid. Afraid that whatever Michael had written inside that letter might shatter the fragile narrative she had crafted for herself over the past 10 years. She had spent a decade convincing herself that letting go was healing, that silence was peace. What if his words proved otherwise? On the 3rd night, sleep refused to come. The rain had stopped, but the silence was louder than ever. She lit a single candle on her desk, the same way she used to do when writing him letters late at night, as if the ritual could somehow protect her from what was to come. Slowly, deliberately, she peeled open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper written in Michael's looping script. His handwriting hadn't changed, messy, emotional, alive. She exhaled and began to read. "Evelyn, if you're reading this," then either Leah finally found the courage to give it to you, or the world got tired of playing hide and seek with us. "I'm not sure where to start. Maybe with the truth. I remember everything about that night, every word you said, every warning I ignored. I remember the storm, your voice shaking, the look in your eyes that said, 'Please don't go.' And I went anyway. That's on me." People always say that pain teaches you something. But what they don't say is that the lesson might arrive too late to fix what you broke. I spent weeks in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how a single decision could become an avalanche. Not just for me, but for you, for us. I thought about calling, writing, showing up at your door. But shame is a strange kind of paralysis. I kept thinking, what if she hates me now? What if I'm a reminder of everything she regrets? But the real truth is, I didn't want to ask forgiveness until I was ready to forgive myself, and it took me longer than I care to admit. Evelyn stopped reading, pressing the letter to her chest. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She stared at the wall, the memories now flooding in without mercy. The days after the accident, the unanswered calls, the nightmares, how she'd left him that final voicemail, angry, raw and trembling, and then deleted his number just to survive. How she'd buried her grief beneath clinical detachment and academic ambition, hoping logic could cure what love had broken. She turned back to the letter. I heard you're doing well, that you're helping people. That doesn't surprise me. You always understood pain, even before life taught you how to carry it. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry. Not in the empty, rehearsed way people say it when they want to be free of guilt. I mean it in the I would go back and undo it all if I could kind of way. But I can't. All I can do is tell you that you mattered, that our time together, messy and beautiful as it was, meant everything to me. If this letter ever finds you, I hope you're surrounded by light. I hope you've forgiven me even a little. And if not, I hope you've at least found peace. When she finished reading, Evelyn didn't move for a long time. The letter trembled in her hands, the ink catching glints of candlelight. The finality of it made her breath hitch. It wasn't closure, not really. Nothing so clean. But it was a bridge, one she hadn't expected, a key to a door she thought would stay locked forever. She pulled out her own letter, the one she had been trying to finish. The ink was faded now, dried in places where emotion had stalled her pen. She read the first few lines and realized how different it sounded, how much it had tried to say without actually saying anything. She knew then what she had to do. She would write a new letter, not for guilt, not for grief, but for herself. Evelyn chose a different kind of paper this time, soft white with subtle flecks of silver. Something about it felt lighter, freer, less burdened. She set the candle beside her, steadying her breath as she picked up her pen. The room was silent except for the low hum of the radiator and the rhythmic scratching of ink meeting paper. There was no hesitation now. Her words flowed not from sorrow or regret, but from a place she hadn't touched in years, honesty without fear. Michael, I read your letter. I read it slowly twice, then folded it and sat with it for hours before I could even begin to process what I felt. You asked if I could forgive you. I think the better question is, could I ever forgive myself? She paused, eyes misting, then continued. For so long, I carried the weight of what happened like it was solely mine to bear. I thought that if I had just said the right thing, stopped you harder, held you tighter, you wouldn't have left that night. I built a whole world inside myself around that guilt. I poured it into work, into other people's healing because I couldn't face my own. But here's the truth. I've only just come to understand. We both made mistakes. We were two young people trying to love each other through storms we didn't yet know how to name. You were running from something long before that night, and I was trying to fix something I didn't break. We were flawed and beautiful and human. And I forgive you. I forgive you not because you asked, but because I need to let go. Because I've spent 10 years mourning someone who didn't die, but who still vanished from my life like a ghost. I forgive you because it's time. Her hand trembled slightly, but her heart was steady. It felt like pulling thorns from skin. Painful, but freeing. I want you to know that I kept every letter I wrote to you. Pages of thoughts I never had the courage to send. Most of them were angry, some were desperate, but this one is real. I don't know who you are now, not really. The man in the photo I found online looked older, yes, but also grounded, maybe even happy. I hope that's true. I hope you've built something meaningful, that you laugh often and sleep peacefully. And me, I'm still learning, still healing. But I'm not broken anymore, just changed. I don't know if I'll ever send this. Maybe it's enough that I wrote it. Maybe we were just meant to be a chapter, not the whole story. She set the pen down and exhaled deeply, as though she'd been holding her breath for 10 years, and finally let it out. The candle flickered, casting shadows that no longer scared her. She read the letter once more, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same box that held Michael's letter. She didn't seal it this time. She didn't need to. The act of writing it had been enough. That night, Evelyn dreamed of a place she had never seen before, a field filled with tall grass, golden light filtering through the sky, and a bench under a tree where two people once sat in silence. She walked toward it in her dream, barefoot and unburdened, and found a letter waiting on the bench, addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." She opened it. It was blank. And for the first time in years, that emptiness didn't feel like loss. It felt like possibility. Spring arrived softly that year. The city thawed with gentleness, buds of green appearing along sidewalks and windowsills, as if nature was whispering, "It's okay to begin again." Evelyn walked through the park near her apartment more often, taking longer routes to work, noticing things she used to rush past. Children laughing, lovers arguing with smiles in their voices, the rustle of wind through budding trees. She carried a new lightness, a quiet peace she hadn't known she was searching for. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Leah delivered Michael's letter, and in that time, Evelyn had changed in ways that didn't show on the surface. She hadn't told anyone what happened. Not her colleagues, not her clients, not even her sister. The letters remained where she left them, inside the wooden box tucked into her bookshelf, his letter on top, hers beneath it, both unmailed, both sacred. Sometimes she'd take them out and read them together like call and response, a dialogue from two distant shores finally meeting at low tide. One Sunday morning she received an email. It was from the rehab centre, just a general newsletter from the facility. But in the closing line there was a note, written by Dr. Michael, Programme Director. The attached blog post was about recovery, not just from addiction, but from guilt, silence, and broken relationships. Evelyn hesitated, then clicked. Michael wrote in a different voice now, softer, steadier. He talked about how trauma sometimes disguises itself as strength, how healing wasn't a straight line, but a series of revisits and releases. There were no personal references, no mentions of her, but something about the way he phrased one line. Sometimes the hardest letter to write is the one you never send because it's meant to free you, not the person it was written for, made her pause. She didn't cry. Instead, she smiled. She closed the laptop, stood, and pulled the box from the shelf. Her letter was still unsealed. Michael's still smelled faintly of hospital paper and the past. She took them both in her hands, and without overthinking it, she slipped them into a manila envelope. She walked to the small mailbox 2 blocks away, one she had passed daily without ever using. She hesitated only briefly. Then she slid the envelope inside. Not to be sent, but to be surrendered. Let the world have them. Let time eat them. Let healing have its way. Back home, Evelyn brewed herself tea and stood on the balcony as sunlight broke through soft morning clouds. She took out a fresh page of stationery, uncapped her fountain pen, and began to write. Not a letter this time, but a journal entry, just for her. I am not who I was. I am not who I thought I'd be. But I am someone learning, growing, choosing peace. And for once, that's enough. The ink dried slowly, gracefully. There was no pressure to mail it, no need to store it in a box. She was writing her life now, not with apologies or unfinished sentences, but with intention. Not every letter needs to be sent. Some just need to be written. The end.